The year is 1936. A silver-haired industrialist named J. Howard Pugh sits in his mahogany-paneled office overlooking Philadelphia, staring at a problem that threatens to destroy everything he's built. Outside his window, America is convulsing through the Great Depression. Breadlines snake around city blocks. Factories stand silent. And in Washington, Franklin Roosevelt is pushing through programs that Pugh believes will fundamentally transform the American economy. But Pugh's real concern isn't political, it's spiritual. Because across America, ministers are climbing into pulpits every Sunday and preaching that Jesus Christ himself would support Roosevelt's New Deal. They're telling congregations that Christianity demands economic justice, that wealth inequality is sinful, and that true followers of Christ must fight for the poor and oppressed. Pugh, one of America's richest men, has a different interpretation of Christianity, and he's about to launch a campaign that will fundamentally reshape American religion for the next century. What happens next is one of the most successful propaganda operations in human history, a story so audacious that if it were fiction, you'd call it unbelievable. This is the story of how a religion founded by a homeless rabbi who said, "Blessed are the poor," became the intellectual foundation for defending the wealth of billionaires. It's the story of how Jesus Christ was quietly recruited into the service of American capitalism, and how millions of Christians were convinced that their faith demanded they support economic policies that made them poorer while making the rich even richer. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. It almost didn't work. There was a moment right around 1935 when American Christianity was on the verge of becoming a revolutionary force for economic change. The social gospel movement was sweeping through churches, convincing millions of believers that following Jesus meant building heaven on earth through economic justice. What changed? How did we get from there to here? How did the man who drove money changers from the temple become the patron saint of Wall Street? Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most consequential religious transformations in modern history. But before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now and then drop a comment telling me your profession and where you're watching from. Are you a nurse in Nebraska? A teacher in Tokyo? A mechanic in Manchester? I want to know who's discovering these hidden truths alongside me. Our story begins not in a church or a seminary, but in the aftermath of the most devastating economic collapse in American history. October 1929 had shattered more than stock portfolios. It had shattered faith in the entire American economic system. For decades, wealthy Americans had told themselves a comforting story, that their riches were evidence of God's blessing, that poverty reflected moral failings, and that any attempt to redistribute wealth was essentially fighting against divine will. This wasn't just economic theory, it was theology. They called it the gospel of wealth, and it perfectly aligned spiritual virtue with material success. But the Depression destroyed that narrative overnight. When banks failed and factories closed, when breadlines stretched for miles and families lost everything through no fault of their own, it became impossible to argue that wealth was simply God's reward for righteousness. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped a generation of ministers who offered a radically different interpretation of Christianity. They called it the social gospel, and it was spreading through American churches like wildfire. Walter Rauschenbusch, a Baptist minister working in New York's Hell's Kitchen, watched immigrant families crowded into tenements while robber barons built palaces with more rooms than entire neighborhoods. He didn't see this as God's plan. He saw it as a fundamental betrayal of Christian teaching. Rauschenbusch preached that Jesus came not just to save individual souls, but to transform society itself. The kingdom of heaven wasn't some distant afterlife reward. It was something Christians were called to build right here on earth through economic justice. Washington Gladden, a Congregationalist minister in Ohio, drove this message even further. He argued that Christianity demanded the right of workers to organize, that businesses had moral obligations to their employees, and that massive inequality was a social sin that required systematic repentance. When coal miners went on strike, Gladden didn't condemn their greed. He condemned the greed of mine owners who paid starvation wages while living in luxury. These weren't fringe radicals preaching from storefront churches. These were mainstream Protestant leaders with massive congregations and national influence. By the 1930s, the Federal Council of Churches, representing 33 denominations and millions of believers, had officially endorsed what they called a social order which will make the love of God effective in human relations. What did that mean in practice? It meant supporting labor unions. It meant endorsing government programs to help the poor. It meant questioning whether unlimited capitalism was compatible with Christian teaching. It meant taking seriously Jesus' warning that you cannot serve both God and money. For America's corporate elite, this was nothing short of theological terrorism. Here's where our story takes its first dramatic turn. Because the wealthy didn't respond to this challenge by abandoning Christianity, instead they decided to recapture it. Enter James W. Fifield Jr., a man whose name has been largely forgotten, but whose influence echoes through every megachurch sermon and political rally in modern America. Fifield was a Congregationalist minister, but he wasn't ministering to the poor. He was preaching to the wealthy elite of Los Angeles from his prestigious First Congregational Church, telling them exactly what they wanted to hear, that God loved capitalism, that wealth was indeed a divine blessing, and that government interference in the economy was essentially Satan's work. But Fifield was smart enough to know that simply defending the rich wouldn't be enough. He had to reframe the entire theological conversation. So in 1935, the same year Roosevelt launched Social Security, Fifield launched something far more ambitious: a systematic campaign to convince American Christians that free market capitalism wasn't just compatible with their faith, it was required by it. Fifield's genius lay in understanding that he couldn't simply tell people to ignore Jesus' teachings about the poor. Instead, he had to reinterpret them completely. According to Fifield's version of Christianity, when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," he wasn't talking about economic poverty at all. He was talking about being poor in spirit, meaning humble before God regardless of your wealth. When Jesus criticized the rich young ruler who couldn't give up his possessions, Fifield argued, the problem wasn't wealth itself, but spiritual attachment to material things. A rich person who remained properly humble could be just as blessed as anyone else. When Jesus drove the money changers from the temple, he wasn't opposing commerce, he was opposing government interference in free trade. It was interpretive gymnastics that would make Olympic athletes dizzy, but Fifield had something most ministers didn't: unlimited funding from America's largest corporations. The National Association of Manufacturers was facing an existential crisis. Public opinion polling showed that most Americans blamed big business for the Depression and supported Roosevelt's New Deal programs. Traditional political arguments weren't working. When corporate spokesmen defended capitalism, people rolled their eyes. When politicians argued for free markets, voters elected their opponents. But what if the argument came from preachers instead of politicians? What if Americans could be convinced that opposing big business meant opposing God himself? This is where the story gets truly fascinating, because the man who provided the intellectual framework for this transformation wasn't a theologian or a minister. He was an advertising executive named Bruce Barton, and his contribution to American Christianity was more influential than most people realize. Barton had revolutionized American advertising by understanding that people didn't buy products, they bought identities. You weren't purchasing soap, you were purchasing cleanliness and respectability. You weren't buying a car, you were buying freedom and status. Barton's insight was that emotional associations were more powerful than rational arguments. Now he turned this same psychology toward religion. In 1925, Barton published The Man Nobody Knows, a biography of Jesus that became one of the decade's bestsellers. But this wasn't the gentle shepherd of Sunday school. Barton's Jesus was a dynamic business executive, the ultimate entrepreneur, the greatest salesman who ever lived. According to Barton, Jesus picked up 12 men from the bottom ranks of business and forged them into an organization that conquered the world. The disciples weren't spiritual seekers, they were the world's first sales team. The parables weren't moral lessons, They were marketing strategies designed to communicate complex ideas to target audiences. The Sermon on the Mount wasn't a call for justice, it was primitive self-help psychology. This reimagining of Jesus as a successful businessman resonated powerfully with Americans who wanted to believe that their material ambitions were spiritually justified. But many Christians weren't buying it, especially those struggling through the Depression. That's where Fifield's organizational genius came in. He realized that changing American Christianity couldn't look like a top-down corporate campaign. It had to appear to be a genuine grassroots religious movement. So, in 1940, he founded Spiritual Mobilization, and he began systematically recruiting ministers across the country to spread his pro-business gospel. Here's the beautiful part of Fifield's strategy. He didn't directly tell ministers what to preach. Instead, he sent them carefully crafted educational materials that made anti-government, pro-business arguments using biblical language and Christian imagery. He organized conferences where conservative ministers could network and share ideas. He created magazines and radio programs that reached millions of Americans with superficially religious content that happened to align perfectly with corporate political interests. The funding for all this came from a who's who of American business power. J. Howard Pugh of Sun Oil, B. E. Hutchinson of Chrysler, the presidents of General Motors, Republic Steel, and dozens of other major corporations poured money into Fifield's operation. But their involvement was carefully hidden from public view. When Americans heard these messages, they thought they were hearing authentic Christian teaching, not corporate propaganda. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect. World War II had ended, and America was entering an era of unprecedented prosperity. The same people who had supported the New Deal during the Depression were now enjoying suburban homes, new cars, and steady paychecks. The idea that God blessed those who worked hard and that poverty often reflected personal failings became much more appealing when you weren't poor yourself. But Fifield and his corporate allies were about to face their biggest test yet. The Cold War was beginning, and suddenly the conversation about capitalism versus socialism took on life and death urgency. Here's where our story takes another unexpected turn, because conservative Christians didn't just oppose communism on political or economic grounds. They transformed anti-communism into a holy war, arguing that atheistic socialism was literally Satan's strategy to destroy Christian civilization. The most influential voice in this transformation was a businessman named R.G. Letourneau, who had become fabulously wealthy manufacturing earth-moving equipment during World War II. Letourneau traveled the country speaking to Christian groups, arguing that God had blessed America with prosperity specifically because of its commitment to free enterprise, and that socialism represented humanity's rebellion against divine economic principles. Letourneau's message solved a theological problem that had troubled Christians for centuries: how to reconcile Jesus' teachings about wealth and poverty with their own material success. According to Letourneau's interpretation, American prosperity wasn't something Christians needed to feel guilty about. It was evidence of God's blessing on a righteous nation that followed biblical economic principles. The breakthrough moment came in 1954, when Congress added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. This wasn't just symbolic. It represented the triumph of a particular vision of American identity that fused Christian faith with capitalist economics and anti-communist politics. But the real architect of this fusion was a Presbyterian minister named Peter Marshall, who served as chaplain to the U.S. Senate during the crucial post-war years. Marshall's prayers before Senate sessions regularly invoked divine blessing on American business and condemnation of socialist policies. His sermons, broadcast on radio stations across the country, argued that America was God's chosen nation precisely because it had embraced free enterprise. By the 1950s, this transformation was largely complete. Polling showed that most white American Christians believed capitalism was more compatible with Christian teaching than socialism, that wealth generally reflected hard work and moral virtue, and that government programs to help the poor were less important than individual charity and personal responsibility. But this theological counter-revolution created a problem that its architects hadn't fully anticipated. What happened when capitalist practices clearly conflicted with Christian values? This tension exploded into public view during the Civil Rights Movement. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other Christian leaders began challenging segregation and economic inequality, they didn't just face political opposition. They faced theological opposition from fellow Christians who had been taught that radical activism was essentially communist infiltration of the church. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, officially supported segregation using biblical arguments. They claimed that God had ordained racial separation and that challenging this divine order was rebellion against Christian teaching. But King and his allies fought back using the same weapon that had been turned against them: biblical interpretation. King's letter from Birmingham jail wasn't primarily a political document. It was a theological argument that authentic Christianity required fighting against injustice, even when that fight challenged social stability and economic hierarchies. Here's what's remarkable about this theological civil war. The side that opposed civil rights ultimately lost that particular battle, but they won the larger war over the soul of American Christianity. How? By adapting their arguments to changing social circumstances. When explicit racism became socially unacceptable, conservative Christian leaders pivoted to new arguments that achieved similar results. Instead of arguing that God ordained racial inequality, they argued that God ordained economic inequality. Instead of claiming that civil rights activism was communist, they claimed that welfare programs and wealth redistribution were unchristian. This evolution was perfected by a new generation of Christian leaders who emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, and others built multimedia empires that reached millions of Christians with a message that fused conservative theology with free market economics. But these leaders learned from their predecessors' mistakes. Instead of making abstract arguments about capitalism, they focused on cultural issues like abortion, homosexuality, and family values that generated emotional responses and political activism. The economic agenda remained unchanged, but now it was packaged with hot-button social issues that motivated voter turnout. This brings us to one of the most fascinating characters in our entire story, Jim Bakker, a televangelist who embodied the complete fusion of Christianity and materialism. Bakker built a Christian broadcasting empire in the 1970s and 1980s from a luxury complex that included hotels, shopping centers, and amusement parks. He told audiences that God wanted them to be wealthy, that donating to his ministry would result in divine financial blessings, and that poverty was primarily a result of insufficient faith. This prosperity gospel represented the logical conclusion of a century-long process of transforming Christianity from a religion that challenged worldly power into a religion that sanctified it. When Bakker's empire collapsed in scandal, many expected this to discredit the prosperity gospel. Instead, it evolved and became more sophisticated. New leaders like Joel Osteen and Joyce Meyer avoided obvious corruption while maintaining the essential message that Christianity should improve your life in material as well as spiritual terms. This transformation had profound political consequences. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, he received overwhelming support from white evangelical Christians, despite his obvious lack of personal piety and his policies that primarily benefited wealthy Americans at the expense of the working class. Reagan's success revealed how completely the rebranding had succeeded. Millions of Christians and working-class communities voted enthusiastically for candidates who opposed their economic interests. How was this possible? Conservative Christian leaders had successfully redefined what it meant to vote your values. Supporting candidates who promised to outlaw abortion became more important than supporting candidates who promised to raise the minimum wage. But here's the most remarkable part. While American Christianity was being transformed into capitalism's greatest defender, Christians elsewhere were reaching completely opposite conclusions. In Latin America, liberation theology was spreading rapidly. In South Africa, Christian leaders like Desmond Tutu argued that apartheid and economic oppression were incompatible with Christian teaching. The contrast revealed that the rebranding of American Christianity wasn't an inevitable result of biblical interpretation. It was a specific historical development shaped by particular political and economic interests. By the 1990s, this rebranding was so complete that most American Christians couldn't imagine their faith being interpreted differently. A 1996 survey found that 73% of white evangelical Christians believed free market capitalism was the economic system most consistent with Christian teaching. But this consensus was about to face its greatest challenge in decades. The 2008 financial crisis shattered many Americans' faith in unregulated markets. Millions lost their homes and jobs while wealthy executives received bailouts. For the first time since the 1930s, large numbers of Americans began questioning unlimited trust in market mechanisms. This questioning intensified dramatically when Pope Francis was elected in 2013. Francis began criticizing unfettered capitalism and arguing that extreme inequality was incompatible with Christian teaching. In his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, Francis wrote, "Just as the commandment, 'Thou shalt not kill,' sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say 'Thou shalt not' to an economy of exclusion and inequality." Francis's critique created a crisis for American Christian leaders who had spent decades arguing that supporting capitalism was a religious duty. But younger American Christians, especially those struggling with student debt and economic insecurity, began asking uncomfortable questions about their faith and politics. This generational divide has created the most significant theological crisis in American Christianity since the Civil Rights era. Surveys show that Christians under 35 are far more likely than their parents to support government programs addressing inequality and to view capitalism with suspicion rather than reverence. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these trends. When millions lost jobs while essential workers risked their lives for poverty wages, the prosperity gospel's message that wealth reflected divine blessing became impossible to maintain. Racial justice protests following George Floyd's murder forced Christians to confront historical connections between their faith and systemic oppression. This brings us to the present moment, where American Christianity finds itself at a crossroads. To understand what's at stake, we need to return to the actual teachings of the historical Jesus. The Jesus described in the Gospels was a first-century rabbi who lived in one of the most unequal societies in human history. In this context, his teachings take on a political dimension that has been systematically obscured. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," he was speaking to people who were literally poor, not offering metaphorical comfort. The Gospel of Luke presents a consistent message. God sides with the oppressed, wealth creates spiritual dangers, and following Jesus requires concrete action to help those in need. Luke includes the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where the wealthy person goes to hell simply for ignoring a poor man's suffering. It includes Jesus' teaching that you cannot serve both God and money. For the first 3 centuries of Christian history, the church was primarily a movement of the poor and marginalized. Wealthy converts were expected to give away most possessions and live simply. The idea that wealth was divine blessing would have been incomprehensible to early Christians. This historical perspective reveals how radical the transformation of American Christianity really was. In less than a century, a religion that had spent nearly 2,000 years teaching suspicion of wealth and power was successfully converted into defending both. But this transformation wasn't inevitable, and it's not irreversible. Today, a new generation of Christian leaders is challenging the fusion of faith and capitalism. Organizations like Sojourners are working to rebuild connections between Christian faith and economic justice. Seminary students are studying liberation theology, preparing to lead churches that take seriously Jesus' teachings about wealth and poverty. Surveys show that growing numbers of American Christians support policies like universal health care and progressive taxation that previous generations considered socialist heresies. More importantly, these Christians are developing theological frameworks that support their positions, arguing that following Jesus requires challenging systems that concentrate wealth and power. The prosperity gospel that promised health and wealth to faithful Christians has been revealed as a cruel hoax for millions who did everything they were told, but still faced economic insecurity. The political alliance between conservative Christianity and pro-business policies has produced outcomes many Christians find impossible to reconcile with their faith. This is why the current moment represents such a crucial turning point. For the first time since the 1930s, large numbers of Christians are questioning the assumption that their faith requires supporting capitalism. Whether this leads to lasting change will depend on broader social developments. If inequality continues growing and climate change produces visible catastrophes, the prosperity gospel's promises will become even harder to believe. The rebranding that succeeded during an era of prosperity may fail during an era of crisis. What's certain is that this struggle will have consequences far beyond religious communities. How Christians understand their faith's relationship to economics will shape debates over healthcare, education, taxation, and social programs for decades. The transformation from a religion that challenged wealth to one that defended it represents one of history's most successful influence campaigns. But influence campaigns can be reversed and historical transformations can be transformed again. The Jesus who drove money changers from the temple, who said the last shall be first, who promised the meek would inherit the earth, never went away. He was simply hidden behind interpretations designed to make his radical message safe for the powerful. Now, in an era when that power is being questioned, the radical Jesus is being rediscovered by Christians tired of being told that following him means defending systems that create unnecessary suffering. The question that will define the next chapter isn't whether American Christianity will evolve, but whether it will evolve to honor its founders' concern for the marginalized or find new ways to sanctify injustice. That question will be answered by ordinary Christians who must decide what following Jesus means in their daily lives, voting choices, and relationships with struggling neighbors. The rebranding of American Christianity was accomplished by wealthy donors and skilled organizers who understood that changing how people think about faith could change how they think about everything. Any rebranding moving in a different direction will require similar organization from people who believe Christianity should challenge rather than sanctify unjust power. Whether they succeed will determine not just the future of American religion, but American democracy itself. Understanding this history doesn't require taking particular positions on Christianity or capitalism, but it does require acknowledging that their fusion was a deliberate political project, not inevitable theological development. And if it was deliberately constructed, it can be deliberately reconstructed by people who believe their faith should inspire them to build a more just world rather than defend an unjust one. The Jesus who blessed the poor and warned the rich offers remarkable resources for reimagining Christianity's role in American society. Whether contemporary Christians will use those resources remains to be seen. But for the first time in decades, the possibility genuinely exists that American Christianity might remember who it was before it became what powerful people needed it to be. And in that remembering, there might be hope not just for the church, but for all those it was originally called to serve. Thank you for taking this incredible journey through one of the most consequential yet hidden stories in American history. If this documentary opened your eyes to connections you never considered, if it made you question assumptions you never thought to examine, then you need to share it with others ready to see beyond official narratives. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started uncovering the secret forces that shaped our world. Next week, we're diving into another shocking story of mass persuasion. How the tobacco industry didn't just sell cigarettes, they sold an entire worldview about freedom and personal choice that influenced American culture for decades. And here's what I really want to know. Drop a comment telling me your profession and where you're watching from. Are you a social worker questioning everything you were taught about poverty? A business student wondering what capitalism really costs? A pastor rethinking what the gospel demands? I want to know how these hidden histories are landing with people from all walks of life. Remember, the most powerful weapon against manipulation is understanding how it works. Once you see the strings, you can't unsee them. And once you understand how ordinary people's deepest beliefs can be shaped by extraordinary wealth and influence, you become much more dangerous to those who profit from your ignorance. This is Professor Archive, reminding you to keep questioning everything, keep digging deeper, and never forget that the stories we're told about our past shape the futures we're willing to accept. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep seeking the truth that powerful people prefer you never discover.